Hello everyone, this is Dr. Everson, providing you some information this week on Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. This week will be wonderfully short. I hope you don't feel discouraged by that. I find students are often encouraged by having a little bit less to do. It's supposed to be that way by design in light of Thanksgiving, which is coming up, and I hope you all have a good Thanksgiving. Also, I'm going to share a little bit of personal information with you guys, just so that I might, if you're a person of prayer, you might keep my family in mind. And this is also part of the reason why the week will be a little bit shorter in terms of the content. My father has pancreatic cancer, and sorry if this is makes anyone uncomfortable or it makes you sad, but I think it's good just to be honest with what's going on. My father has pancreatic cancer, and we're moving him into hospice this week. Been a difficult week. So his name's Leland. That's my dad. So anyway, please pray for him and my mother Ann, myself. Just many of you are involved in ministry as I am, and there's lots going on, and it's important work, and you always want to be a good steward. At the same time, we need to cope with life and be there for friends and family. So it's becoming a balancing act these days. But anyway, that's sort of where things are at. So on that sad note, let's move on and talk a bit about the book of Proverbs. You see Solomon there on his throne, judging wisely. And of course, the book of Proverbs is associated with Solomon, as are Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes. I think when we talked about Solomon, I think I shared the rabbinic tradition that Solomon wrote Song of Songs when he was a young man and full of passion, and he wrote Proverbs when he sat on the throne and sort of ruled with wisdom, and he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes when he was old and sort of sadder but wiser. And of course, today scholars debate whether Solomon wrote any of these things, and there's good arguments for and against, but that might help you as a mnemonic with all of these things. When it comes to authorship, let's start here with sort of its nature, the epitome of traditional wisdom. When we talked about the book of Job, we compared traditional wisdom with non-traditional wisdom, and this is a good concept to keep in mind because I think it helps organize a lot of the information in the Bible. It's an important distinction of the type of literature. But traditional wisdom, in short, is that good things happen to good people. Train a child up in the way he should go, and all the days he will follow it, right? Sort of an if-then. If you do good, good will result. If you do bad, bad will result. That's traditional wisdom. And of course, non-traditional wisdom is that bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people. And this is also associated with Deuteronomy. We talked about the Deuteronomistic history before, and Proverbs is the epitome of that. And in ministry, in theology, I think it's important to realize that the book of Proverbs isn't a book of promises, right? You do have many instances where it says, if you do this, then that will happen. That happens many times in the book of Proverbs. And to read those as promises, I think, has a long-term it's not going to succeed in the long term, right? Because life doesn't work that way. Many people train up a child in the way he should go, and many of those children don't follow in that. Maybe you were one of them for a time, and certainly I didn't always follow the training of my parents. So anyway, Proverbs is the epitome of traditional wisdom, and that shouldn't be new to you. It's associated with Solomon, as you might imagine. I don't get into the author debates. They're interesting, and I follow them, and it's good to be aware of what people say, because you do have people who read their Bibles carefully, and they'll come to you with questions, and it's good to be knowledgeable about these things. The book of Proverbs, whether Solomon wrote it or did not write it, is in our Bible, and it has the authority of Scripture, and so I read it and value it, regardless of its authorship. Historically, though, it is associated with Solomon, and Solomon, of course, is associated with wisdom. So, okay, it's a miscellaneous collection of proverbial sayings. Miscellaneous in the sense that there isn't it's difficult to find an arc of meaning going from one verse to the next, right? These different sayings seem to be thrown into the same bag in not necessarily a particular order. So at least that's how I see it. You probably could find a rhyme and reason to their exact ordering, and maybe the author did have that in mind. I think it's difficult to find. So as it appears to me, it's a miscellaneous collection of proverbial sayings. That's the nature of it. And so then Proverbs becomes a book that is difficult to read straight through. It's, of course, like any proverbial wisdom, it's good to read it and to be aware of it and to sort of store these nuggets of wisdom in your mind, because later they become useful. But it's not like reading Harry Potter or reading, one of the narratives from the Old Testament, because these things are sort of stacked one upon another as a miscellaneous collection. Okay, it's geared for young men. Some people, that makes them uncomfortable, that a book of the Bible would be written with one group in mind, but that's what Proverbs is. Of course, you do have the topic of women, and there's the Proverbs woman, as some people like to refer to that passage as. And of course, there you do see a discussion of women, but it's a discussion of women for young men, and that's the nature of it. And so I think it's a useful book for everybody, and it's a useful book for young men. And of course, that's a whole field of study, the different challenges that groups face today, whether it's young women or older women, or young men or older men. Anyway, a lot of the challenges that young men faced in the ancient world, they face today, right? Making your way in the world, finding a good partner, things like this. And so Proverbs is useful for that. Okay, book of Ecclesiastes. There you see somebody I like a lot, even though he was a communist for a time. That's and I'm not down with communism as a political theory myself, but that's none other than Pete Seeger playing his long neck banjo. And maybe this is something you know, maybe it's something you don't know, but he has a Woody Guthrie on his guitar. Woody Guthrie, the American folk singer, who sort of flourished in the 40s, and well, basically in the 40s, and by the 50s he was already sort of coming out of the spotlight. But Woody Guthrie has had a guitar that says, "This machine kills fascists," and of course he was in support of the war, and he was against the Nazis. And Pete Seeger on his banjo writes, this machine surrounds hate with love and forces it to surrender," which, you say it out loud, it sounds kind of silly, but he's a sweet guy. I love his music. There he is with his long neck banjo. And the reason he's on there, you might be wondering, is because he took a chapter out of Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and he turned it into a song, which was covered by the Turtles, and it became very popular in the 1960s. To everything, turn, 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 there is a season, turn, turn, turn. I won't sing it for you, but it goes on from there. So he took that biblical passage and he turned it into a song, and it became popular. So the book of Ecclesiastes made it into pop culture of the 60s, which is fascinating. Author and date. When you read a passage like Ecclesiastes 3, it, well, here, let me grab it real quick. All right, this is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1. Lately I've been reading the CSB. It's a translation that I do like. So here we go. Ecclesiastes 3:1. There is an occasion for everything, and a time for every activity under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to avoid embracing, a time to search and a time to count as lost, a time to keep away and a time to throw, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And of course, Pete Seeger turned that into an anti-war song, a protest song, which is good. And the author of Ecclesiastes, of course, in this poem, you get a sort of a whole view of life, that there's a time for everything and there's a purpose under heaven. And some people wonder if the author of Song of Songs, and this is if you date Song of Songs to a later time period, namely the Persian period or even the Hellenistic time period. So maybe it comes from the 400s or the 300s or even the 200s, some people wonder. Of course, in the 2nd century, in the 100s BC, you have a translation of it into Greek, and so it would be difficult for it to have been written after it was translated into Greek. So the Septuagint puts a hard date on these things. They have to be older than that. So some people want to push it all the way up to that time period. But some people wonder if the author of Ecclesiastes wasn't linked to the school of Stoicism, the philosophical school of Stoicism. And I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of philosophy, though my training is in Old Testament and in languages. I love exploring Stoic, and this sounds nerdy, and I'm nerdy, guilty as charged. But I love exploring Stoic philosophy, Epicurean philosophy. We talked a bit before about the modern philosophy of nihilism and existentialism. I think it's good to understand these things. And one line that comes out of Ecclesiastes that would support this, or the value of this, would be that there is nothing new under the sun. Or there's the Latin phrase mutatis mutandis, which means the more things, loosely translated, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Long story short, the book of Ecclesiastes, in that passage, you see this idea that there's good and there's bad. Things happen this way and then that way, and there's a time for all of it. And it all moves according to a purpose. And you shouldn't wrestle with the stage that you're in, but realize that the stage that you're in is something that happens. And it won't go on forever. And this is how life is. And the Stoics became resigned to their plight. They believed that there was a divine, an impersonal deity or a divine logos, as in the sense of logic or meaning or purpose, that permeated all of reality, especially humans. Humans had sort of the highest ratio of this fiery spirit or breath that gave everything its purpose. And so everything moved according to a perfect plan, the Stoics believed. They didn't believe in a personal God, and they didn't believe in a spiritual world that we go to when we die, like the Platonists believed in. But they did believe that everything moved according to a perfect purpose, and they became resigned to whatever state that they were in. If they were suffering, they became resigned to their suffering, thinking that it was for the best in the long run. And so they became, this is where we get our word stoic. And the book of Ecclesiastes feels that way a bit, which is hard to read. It makes it sort of a bitter book, but at the same time, I think there's truth and there's wisdom in that. Like, we go through difficult times, and sometimes the difficulty brings about a good end, or the difficulty is something that needs to happen and it can't be avoided. And of course, the stage that I'm in right now with my father's illness, these thoughts are on my mind. Not that I'm going to try to make sense of everything at the moment. It's sort of one foot in front of the other. But long story short, author and date, some people take the book of Ecclesiastes and they date it to this late time period, and they view it as sort of the forerunner to, or it's from the early stages of Stoic philosophy. And so that's a worthwhile point to know, and that it addresses author and date, but it also gets at the character of Ecclesiastes, where it is sort of Stoic in nature when you read it. We have talked about traditional and non-traditional wisdom. The book of Ecclesiastes, you should know, contains non-traditional wisdom. And again, that shouldn't be a news flash. The primary conclusion in the book of Ecclesiastes we can find in its first chapter. And maybe I shouldn't say primary, maybe I should say initial, because the author does sort of come around, but the CSB translates this passage as absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. What does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Or, of course, the famous King James says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I think the NIV says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And again, that's non-traditional wisdom. Ecclesiastes will go on to talk about how the rain falls on the wicked as it does on the just. That is to say, they receive blessings from heaven even though their lives are corrupt. And, so the book of Ecclesiastes can be, how do we use this in ministry? How do we use this in our lives? I think it's something we can read when we struggle and life is hard. It's in chapter 3 that the author does come to a more positive conclusion, writing, I perceive that this is verses 14 and 15. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. So it's the author doesn't sort of stay in this meaningless place, and it reminds me of the Psalms of Lamentation, where the author sort of cries out, but then eventually finds strength in God. And I think that's the human experience. That's what we should do. In difficulty, we should lament and we should cry out, and we shouldn't stay there. We have a God who seeks to pick us up and encourage us and strengthen us. Okay, I'll keep going on here. Right, bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. That's the definition of non-traditional wisdom, and that's what we see in the book of Ecclesiastes. Okay, moving on to our last bit here, Song of Songs. Anyway. Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, as it's called in Hebrew. It is the best title ever. And I say that to make a joke. I'm trying to get at the idea of the superlative. In languages, we have good, better, and best. We have sort of a normal adjective. We have a comparative adjective, or some people call it the elative, which would be better, where you're comparing one with another. And then you have the superlative, which would be best. And the way they do that in Hebrew, and this is useful because it shows up in a number of places, is they say the something of somethings. So if somebody is the best student ever, it's the student of students, or the best teacher ever would be the teacher of teachers. And so the best song ever, the way you would say that in Hebrew would be song of songs. Shir, and shir, of course, is the word for song in Hebrew. So Shir HaShirim is the song of songs. And so it's known as sort of the super song or the best song ever. Is the title in Hebrew, which is interesting. And of course, hopefully coming to mind for you would be something like the King of Kings or the Lord of Lords. These phrases, of course, are used to describe our God. Okay, so that's what the title means. It is, again, associated with Solomon, as are the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And people, traditionally, Solomon is thought to be the author, although people debate whether he is today. And your textbook does a really great job of going through all of these issues. As textbooks do, they're often primarily concerned with authorship and date and all of the endless arguments that go back and forth around those things. So if that's something you're interested in, please dig into your textbook. I won't rehearse the debate here. It's love poetry. When you read through it, it was written about it's concerned about young couples that are in love and they seek each other out and they want to be together. And it describes, physical things of touching, kissing, and all of that stuff that, for a certain time in your life, that's what we focus on and we obsess about, and it's a normal human thing, and it ends up in the Bible, I think, for that reason. And they put this subpoint there, it's love poetry, even if things have changed. Well, the language that they use, and this is interesting, that things have changed. The language that they use to describe their beautiful partner is different than what we do, things we would do. And, these could be anecdotes that you would use in your preaching, I don't know. But comparing, talking about your lover's beautiful stomach and saying, oh, and her stomach is like a heap of wheat, like that I mean, there's lots of jokes you could work in there, but that's not going to get me real far in a way with my wife. Or her teeth are like a flock of goats, that's like, your mouth makes me think of goats. It just doesn't work that way anymore today. But these were compliments, and you can sort of see them. You can see how they would be complimentary. And you may have to do some thinking, but maybe brilliantly white teeth. And if you're a farmer, farming metaphors are familiar and good to you. It's how you make your living and where you find purpose. But anyway, it's love poetry, which brings me to another point that's interesting: the canonical debate. The process of books making it into the Bible is something we've talked a bit about in this course. How does it happen? Right? Did the author of Song of Songs say, you know what I'm going to do today? I think I'm going to write another chapter of the Bible. Or did Paul do this with all of his 13 letters in the New Testament? It didn't work that way. Or David didn't do this with the Psalms. Like, ooh, I think I'll call this the 23rd Psalm. These things were written, and then later people realized their value, realized sort of their status. And the Song of Songs, some people didn't want it in. And you can find books from sort of the Old Testament time period that didn't make it into the Bible, and you can find books from the New Testament time period that didn't make it into the Bible. And some people did want those books to get in. And then other books were debated, and some didn't want them in, but they did make it in. And there's books like that in the New Testament, and we have that here in the Old Testament. Some people didn't want Song of Songs to make its way into the Bible because of its sort of provocative nature, that it's written about lovers wanting to be together, and these topics can make some people uncomfortable, or perhaps it's not decent for mixed groups to talk about in public, because Scripture was always read publicly. I mean, this is for most of Scripture's life, that's been the context, has been public reading. In the modern world, we sit in private and read it in a personal way, but in the ancient world, it was always read in public. And so reading these things aloud in front of children and men reading them in front of women, some people think would be uncomfortable. Like watching a love scene and you're sitting next to your mom, right? So that can make people uncomfortable. And so within Judaism, there's this famous Council of Jamnia that you can read about if you'd like. But in Judaism, as the story goes, it was viewed as a metaphor of God's love for Israel. And this is how it makes it into the Bible, because it's not really describing a man trying to find his lover and, hold her and kiss her. It's really describing how God seeks to love Israel. And of course, this brings up a question of interpretation. How do we interpret the Bible? Is that what the author intended? Probably not. Is that how we should interpret the Bible? And as Christians, we largely say no, right? Historically, that is a method of interpretation that would come to be known as the allegorical method of interpretation. And there's a Jewish scholar from Alexandria named Philo who does this. Back in the time period shortly before Christ, there were Christians who would interpret the Bible this way, most famously Origen. Paul does an allegory in the New Testament on Sarah and Hagar. And so should the Song of Songs be interpreted allegorically? That's probably how it made it into the Bible, but we don't want to do that today. And so personally, I feel like, yes, that is how it got into the Bible. But that's not how I want to interpret it. So I think it's good that it's in the Bible because this is part of the human experience, and these are natural things and good things, and that's why they're in there. Just like why do we have all the different types of Psalms in there? Because these are the experiences that we have, and ultimately they teach us more about who God is. And so we can learn more about God through the Song of Songs. And so that's why it makes it into the Bible. Okay, and I'll mention here this interesting Targum translation. And if you want to see how it was interpreted in Judaism, there is and I put translation in quotations because it's a paraphrase. In the Aramaic translation of the Old Testament, which was used for public reading in the synagogue, and they call these things Targum. Some people call them Targumim, which would be the Hebrew way of pluralizing this Aramaic word. Some people call them Targumin with an N at the end. That would be the Aramaic way of pluralizing the Aramaic word. The Targum paraphrases, and you really even can't call it a paraphrase. It's sort of the original Hebrew verse will be in the translated verse, but they will expand it greatly. The verse might end up 3 or 4 or 5 times the size of the original because they begin telling stories about David as king, and they include a great deal of folklore, and so you can sort of see how it was understood within the history of Judaism. So then when this was read in the synagogue, they would read, they wouldn't read love poetry, they would read this interpretive, often folklorish expansion of the original text. Okay, well, we made it to half an hour. Hopefully that's not too much work for you this week, but it's good. I enjoy doing this, and I hope this is useful and beneficial to you. We'll talk to you later.